When you're trying to make a graph using Excel, the first thing you do is enter your data. X data versus Y data, or independent variable versus dependent variable. I label my columns just so that I remember what I'm doing. I'm using a class set of data of height versus arm span for one of my classes of students. As you can see, some of the students put in their units. While that is good practice to always put a unit with your numbers, Excel doesn't know what to do with units. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight my two columns of data. I do that by left-clicking as I go from one column to the next. I come over to the editing box and go to Find and Select. When I left-click, there's an option to replace. I left-click. What am I trying to find? Centimeters is the unit that was put into all the boxes. So I'm going to put centimeters in the find. And I would like to replace it with a blank. I don't want units there. I go down and click on Replace All. And Excel goes through. It has made 33 replacements. When I click on OK, I can see that I no longer have any words. So the next thing I'm going to do is close my Find and Replace box. And I already have my data highlighted. If you put in your data without having any units in it, you can just highlight your data. I'm going up on the top menu to Insert. And there's a whole section of charts that you can choose from. In chemistry class, we're usually looking at how one variable affects the other variable. So what we're looking at is a scatter plot. So I'm going to left-click on the scatter plot. And I want this first one that doesn't have any lines. We're not trying to smooth out the curve. We're not trying to connect the dots. We just want to see where the data falls. And as you can see, we've already got a graph started. The problem is, this graph has all of the data up at the top. So one of the things I would like to do is fix the graph so that the y-axis, my arm span, has a range closer to the x-axis. You can see at the x-axis it already started it at about 150 and goes up to 185. That's consistent with the data. The y-axis it tries to make cross at 0. In this case, we don't need that to happen. So I right-click on the numbers for the axis. And I scroll down to Format Axis. I left-click there, and I have a bunch of options. In this case, I would like my minimum value, instead of being 0, I'd like to make it 140. So I'm going to click on Fixed, and it lets me type in a number, 140. Now that I've changed that, I'm only going from 140 to 200. Having lines at every 20 centimeters is not very helpful. So I'm going to click on Fixed, and I'm going to pick every 5 centimeters, which is the same major unit that was used on the x-axis. Same thing with the minor unit. It was at 4. I would now like it to be every 1 centimeter. Once I click on Close, you can see it's already fixed the graph. So now I have an x-axis and a y-axis to fit my data. I also want an appropriate name for my chart. So I'm going over to the chart title, and I'm left-clicking. That brings up the text box. What I would like to name this is Height versus Arm Span. Height being the independent variable, and arm span the dependent variable. Unfortunately, right now, I don't have any labels on my axes, so nobody really knows which is height and which is arm span unless they remember the naming convention. So I'm going to go over to chart layouts. Sorry, I'm clicking on layout at the top. And I'm going over to where it says labels. I would like to make some axis titles. So I highlight axis titles and I left click. I'm going to name the horizontal axis first. And I would like to have my title below the axis. It gives me an opportunity with a text box to name my axis. I'm going to name this height in centimeters. It's important that everybody know that these measurements are centimeters. They're not meters or millimeters or inches or feet, which we would never use in a science class. I need to do the same thing on my y-axis. So again, I'm going to axis titles. I'm clicking. This time, I want my primary vertical axis. I would like to have a vertical title. You can choose to have a horizontal title that takes up more space over on the left side of the chart, or you can do a vertical title going down the way we would normally write it if we were making a chart by hand. So again, it gives me a box for my axis title. I'm going to highlight, and my y-axis is arm span in centimeters. And I click somewhere else on the chart. Again, this lets me know what the unit is. I now have pretty good data, and I can see my graph and that it is roughly a linear relationship. One of the things I might do at this point is resize the graph or even move the graph. So if you go back to design, you have an opportunity to move the chart to a new location. I like to make a new sheet, and the chart is its own sheet on Excel. Remember, I did that by going to Move Chart and then clicking on New Sheet. If you want to name the chart the same thing that you're naming the graph, that's always a good idea, especially if you're going to have more than one graph for the same data. Then I click on OK. This is what the graph will look like as a full-page graph. And as you can see, it's pretty easy to read the data. This legend telling us that arm span is our y-axis data. Sometimes you're graphing more than one thing, and so they'll use different symbols and colors, and the legend tells you that. In this case, we only have one set of data, so what I just did was clicked on the data, and now I'm going to right-click on the box, and I'm going to delete this legend. I do not recommend deleting a legend if you are having more than one data series. The last thing we need to do is often we'd like to know what the exact relationship is. In this case, the data looks fairly linear, so we're going to assume that it is a straight line. I can right-click on any of the data points, and you'll see how it has a bunch of X's so that you can see that the data is highlighted. I scroll down to Format Data Series or Add Trend Line. In this case, I'm trying to add a trend line. Format Data Series lets you change the symbol. When I go to Add Trend Line and I click, I get a bunch of options. If you have a growth curve, you might want to do exponential. Sometimes we use logarithmic graphs. It depends on your data. We use logarithmic often for pH or titrations. Polynomial is if you know that your graph is going to be a parabola, for example, or it's going to have a bunch of curves in it. You can make it a polynomial. In this case, I'm going to use a linear curve. One of the things I would like to do is display the equation on the chart. That way, if I want to, I can estimate from my own height what my arm span should be. If you are using this for science fair or research purposes, you might want to display an r² value on the chart. R² goes from 0 to 1. It's always a decimal number. The closer the number is to 1, the stronger the relationship. I'm going to click Close, and I now have a trend line So if I want to, I can just by hand say, okay, I'm 160 centimeters, go up to the line and across to the y-axis. And according to this, my arm span should be about 162, 163 centimeters. Or I'm going to move the equation so I can read it better. And I'm going to do that by clicking on the equation. And then I click and drag the box. I'm just going to move it up into this top corner so it's easier to read. My other option is I can use this equation, y equals 0.8939x plus 19.949, and I can plug in that same 160 centimeters. I might use this equation if I know that I'm 162 centimeters tall. It's harder to read where that is on the graph, so I can go ahead and plug in my x value and, doing algebra, get my y value, which is my arm span. You can see from this r squared value, 0.7589, that's not very good. So we don't really have a linear relationship. It's there. There's a reason to say it's a linear relationship. It's okay. But really, when we're looking at the right equation, you're looking for an r squared value of 0.9, maybe a little bit under that. Please take time to enter your own data into Excel and practice doing some graphs. If you have any other questions, feel free to ask your teacher.